next of today, Professor Vera Bühlmann, and also Paul for the double lecture. Vera is director of the Department of Architecture Theory and Philosophy of Technology at Vienna University of Technology. And as the director, you're also in a sense co-founder of the School for Materialist Research, which is a postgraduate program that engages materialism across architecture, art, design, mathematics, science, philosophy, and politics. And I guess this transversal thinking or bringing all these kind of things together is very much shaped by Vera's career development after having studied philosophy and English in Zurich, and then having obtained a PhD in media theory and philosophy of technics from Basel University. And after that, we've co-founded the Laboratory for Applied Virtuality at DTH in Zurich, and have a guest researcher at the Future Cities Lab in Singapore. And I really like this kind of breadth of these kind of different streams that come together in my thinking, and they have been published in numerous books that I couldn't mention here. But I think what is maybe interesting is to mention, first of all, your recent monograph, Information and Mathematics in the Philosophy of Michel Serres, which came out in 2020. And also the special issue, New Materialist Genealogies in the Minnesota Review, together with Iris and Felicity Coleman. And what I think is, in a sense, if I would name drop some of the wonderful combinations in your titles, like vicarious architectonics, quantum city, quantum literacy, and symbolizing existence, I think that gives you a very good idea of, let's say, the ideas that converge in your thinking. So I'm very happy to hear your presentation.
Thank you so much for this really nice introduction, and also, oops. Okay, good. So thanks a lot for this introduction, and also for being here today. I look forward to talk about schematism, but perhaps more from the side of, I would call it a natural philosophy, or perhaps even object-centric. Also, I'm not at all happy with that. When I was here last time in the Netherlands, it was in Utrecht, I believe, Rosie asked me, and I think she was very right, what do you do with the subject in your thinking? No? So you've mentioned the last book, Mathematics and Information in the Philosophy of Michel Serres, and I was very much attracted by, in the work of Michel Serres, by a notion of an impersonal subject or something like that. But then how to properly think of it, I didn't have an answer then. I have a bit more ideas now, but probably still not an answer. I give it a name for now, today. I will call it Pantope, this impersonal subject. And Pantope literally means all the places. And what is at stake is to then think about how time and space would, what kind of roles they would play. And this is a bit my thrust in my presentation, will be mediated by a notion of the schema, which can do without a notion of space, given primarily. That's also what makes it natural philosophy. So the things I want to talk about are not, I know it's not really the place to make an argument here, especially this book by Michel Serres. I think it's probably the one which is almost never read until now. It came out almost at the same time, like Derrida's Grammatology and Deleuze's Difference and Repetition, so 68, something like this. It's on Leibniz, but it is about computational view upon a reading of Leibniz that very much places the Leibnizian approach in a digital paradigm, if you want, a bit avant la lettre. Also, of course, Leibniz had made huge steps also in binary codings, but it's not a notion of the digital that is much in fashion today in media studies. So I want to give a little bit of what I think are necessary backgrounds to appreciate this book by Serre, which can appear a bit cryptic. So rather than summarizing or giving an argument, I want to put some constellations. This is also the subtitle. It doesn't show now here on the... Oh, where is my cursor? Here. Ah, no, I just made a picture. Okay. So the subtitle is Schema stars, also Schema, étoile et réseau, networks. So schema, stars, and networks. And that is a bit the point, to think within a network of a notion of point that acts as if it's a star relative to a constellation of other points. So there is a kind of a scalarity at work between the constellations for which there is no dimensional space that would render those scales homogeneous. And this is where the points, when acting as a schema, can literally translate and transpose. But these two terms, that will be my point, they involve mathematical thinking. We cannot approach them through linguistics. So it's about the notion of abstraction and mathematical thinking, where the imaginary, so imagination, is not a subjective, psychological, individually rooted faculty, but a faculty of this Pantope. So a body of thinking that is, if you want, generic in a certain sense. For sure it is impersonal. And in such a body of thinking, in such an organon, imagination itself can perceive. And this kind of perception is at play in the difference, as I understand it, between abstraction and generalization. So a simple schema for thinking of this is an orthogonality, whereas the generalization moves horizontally, dispatches and transposes fields horizontally. Abstraction goes vertical always and is in principle unbounded. Is in principle unbounded. De facto, of course, it is bounded precisely by the generalizations it moves with. So this, I understand, is a turn in the topic of schematism, which takes it a bit away from a notion of how the concept relates to an intuition, and instead features very centrally a term that Serre takes from Pascal. It's the chiasm, and the chiasm is this intertwining. No, the chiasm is this intertwining, to which I will come back. It's a figure which is central in, to my surprise, it was Platon's Timaeus. So in a notion of world and world making that involves the figure of the demiurge. And this figure is not a creator, it's a worker. No? So it's a public worker. So it's my point of view, it works with invention because it articulates this kind of a faculty of imagination, which is not individual, but it's, yeah, okay, we will see. So then this notion of world that in the way I want to make this line between the Timaeus and then via Pascal to Leibniz and Serre, this world wouldn't be geo, it wouldn't be the earth. It is a fantastic place. It's perhaps a literary notion. I'm not sure yet if literary is the right way to address this. But so I will just pick up this name by Serre to speak of Pantope. No? So the world as Pantope. And the key change is, whereas we usually think, no, when two different things need to relate to each other, they need at least the common characteristics. And this inversion with abstraction and generalization that I'm thinking about so much says, no, it doesn't need a characteristic, it needs a scale, which can give us a particular characteristic. So a scale that brings things which are not same into a common tuning. And this kind of tuning is what the theory of harmonics in mathematics refers to. So harmonics, whenever I speak of harmonics, I don't mean a paradise and a peace and a harmony. It is the precise mathematics that explains how numbers can work harmonically, which is in my understanding, the main thing that makes Plato's demiurge, the Timaeus, so relevant for today. Because in harmonics, it's not the case that two things cannot coexist, actually. No? So several sounds can sound at the same time and in the same space. There is not the same principle of contradiction like we know it in logics. And this is the key figure for thinking these constellations. So I picked up in my, I will keep it here, it's a bit a marginal note, but perhaps it gives a nice framing. It's a citation with which I submitted my abstract when we planned this event. It's a citation by Wittgenstein, where he says, quite famously, but what is less famous is that the notion of rule actually, I think, I don't remember by whom I took this translation, but I think he's right to say that it's an understanding of the rule as canon, so not in metrical sense. So our paradox is this, Wittgenstein says, when he talks about life forms, no? So Lebensformen, so his translation of natural speaking into forms of life. He says, our paradox is this, a rule, a canon, could not possibly determine a way of action, eine Handlungsweise, as any way of acting would have to be brought in correspondence with that rule, the canon. No? So it's a bit, how can the canon produce a world that will be responsive to itself? So there is a notion of self-referentiality at work, and this is what makes the Timaeus so interesting, because the Timaeus is an idea of how we can think the fabrication of a world such that the world doesn't need anything, so it's entirely resting within itself, but this resting is utterly active. So this resting involves a notion of withholding. It is in harmonics, it is the comma. It's a kind of a repository of all the things that never match when we try to find commensurability, because there is at the very core of it, there is incommensurability at work, you can say, between the circle and the square. No? So I will come back to this to make it less cryptic in a moment. So connecting concepts with the perceptions, not by postulating a correlation between sense and essence, but by finding a harmonic tuning by means of mathematical thinking. This is the understanding of proportioning. So it's a proportioning which can happen according to three different means, and they cannot be mapped onto each other. There is a geometric mean, there is an arithmetic mean, and there is a harmonic mean. No? And the key point is that this distinction between geometry, arithmetics, and harmonics cannot be unified. They're like a tripod. One cannot do without the others, but two can never be reduced to one or deduced from one. So they need to play together in constellations. The world, both in Leibniz as well as in the Timaeus, is a world that is thought of in analogicity. So it's not a representation, it's a modeling, it's an abstract modeling, which takes analogicity to mean proportionateness. So literally, A is to B like C is to D. So it involves 4 terms, not 3. That's what makes it a natural philosophy. So the quadrivium primarily at that level, but the 3 means are 3. So this is like the trivium. So that's the notion of the chiasm, placed between the quadrivium and the trivium. No? So it does away with giving a primacy to either the trivium, like we had it until Renaissance in the Western history largely, and then to the quadrivium like we have it with modernity. It does away with a linear primacy of the two and says, no, they are crossed. They are always crossed. And this crossing, this chiasm, has a precise Pythagorean, a mathematical, also a mystic figure, which is the lambda in the Timaeus. The lambda is what the demiurge begins with when he grasps the soul of the cosmos, whose fabrication he is about to think. And the lambda is literally the figure. So that's where in the Timaeus you have all these harmonic scales. So you have on one leg of the lambda, you have the powers of 2, so the squaring. And on the other hand, you have the powers of 3, which goes with the angles and the circle. And the incommensurability is between the circular and the circular and angular on the one hand, and linear and square, rectangle on the other hand. Between these two legs of the lambda is where architectonics happens in this sense of proportioning. I will not go in detail, it's very complicated if one is not used to as I am not used to this kind of precise mathematical notations. But what comes out of this is a notion of the world that we can think of on the one hand as a sphere, so a spherical model, and the sphere also means there are several layers. So the sphere is connected to how in antiquity they were thinking of the heavens. So you have the distinction between the sublunar sphere and then the fixed stars. And the fixed stars, they give the firmament. So what we see in the blackness of the Weltraum, of the all. So it is a spheric model, but it does not seek to represent the spherical order. Rather, it introduces, I don't know if you can see this, it introduces a way to think the construction of a spherical model in the plural by thinking about how the plane of the ecliptic is where you have the solstices and the equinox. So what gives the year, the course of the sun over a year, and the equatorial plane where they cross. So these two, the way that they interact, they make of the equator, and the equator is literally the figure of the tropics, where the tropes, the figurations, where the metamorphosis, the algebra in mathematical terms is happening. It puts it under the influence of climate, because that's what the plane of the ecliptic gives. The plane of the ecliptic is in an angle with respect to the equator, and it's literally how in antiquity they were thinking of the climate. So the climate changes. So in the equator, the climate is steady. Everywhere else on the round Earth, it changes and it comes in patterns. And this comes from this relation of the, I would say also in Serres, reading the clinamen, so the smallest possible angle of inclination that gives the atomism to think with. So the plane of the ecliptic and the equatorial plane, and they form an imaginary, this is now this organon that I'm interested in, an imaginary extension of the lambda into, so it's not just the two legs, but it's the mirroring of the two legs in the other direction. Yeah, so with this, we can say, and this is now, yesterday I was making this point about forgetting. We are very obsessed with memory today, with keeping a memory, with externalizing technologies to improve, to maximize our limited human faculties and so on. What this thinking involves is an inversion to the memory, which can be grasped through the notion of a forgetting. And this forgetting, this is my key interest in Serres, actually, not only in this book, especially also in the Incandescent. This notion of forgetting happens by incorporation. And incorporation now doesn't primarily incorporate sensations, but the sensations of how the imagination perceives in abstraction. So abstraction organizes the organon of this impersonal body of thinking, which is objective, which is mathematical, so that's why it's not individual. No, whenever you have a formula, it doesn't matter who you are, it just works, or it doesn't. No, so will and biographies and so on, they don't matter. While at the same time, of course, this does not mean that mathematics is not totally subjected to the social constructivist sphere as well, but it's not exhaustively so. That is my point. So then let's give a bit of a contemporary reference why this lambda is not just a kind of a mystic figure that might be fun to reanimate. There is especially one, it's not really a programming language, I would say. He calls it now, this is Stephen Wolfram's Mathematica. What makes it peculiar is that it implemented the lambda calculus. And the lambda calculus is any mathematics. No? And this is the case because it's a pure algebra. So it works tautologically. It works with a notion of identity that can be articulated in as many ways as can be thought. precisely, so thought mathematically. So the lambda calculus abstracts, for example, from this preoccupation that the philosophers of mathematics have between states theory versus category theory, and these religious wars that are happening there. It abstracts from that. It's an operational language. And this is what he emphasizes. This is an article he wrote, I think, last year. It's quite recent, where he emphasizes, so what we've built is a computational language, and that is very important. I don't agree with all the parts that he says, but one thing is especially interesting, and it is that he says, in modernity, with algebra, so with the introduction of zero, mathematics acquired a notation system which can indicate mathematical ideas without mapping them into a semantic field. So without mapping them in a field where meaning would become definite in any kind of way. And he says, with the computational languages that our computation works today, we have a similar step of abstraction. So the way that he puts it is like this. He says it's a language for expressing things in a computational way. And for, I cannot read. And for capturing computational ways of thinking about things. Here you see again the chiasm. Huh? So to describe things in a computational way and to capture the thinking about things in a computational way. Maybe this is a good moment to show, I have a beautiful citation by Pascal, which helped me a lot to understand this chiastic move. Pascal wrote, he says, so the chiasm ties 4 terms, 2 by 2, in one order and then in reverse order. So this is important, it's 4 terms, it's not 3. And examples he gives is the spaces that I ignore and that ignore me. The heart has its reasons that reason does not know. Another one, by space, the universe comprehends, understands me and engulfs me. By thought, I understand it. Or another one, for this figure of the chiasm, to make the small things as the great and the great as the small and easy. So this is the figure of the projected lambda, no? Which doesn't just stand on 2 legs, but which goes in a kind of a funnel of a crossed, like to mix drinks, no? This kind of a double container. And that is why or how the notions of forgetting is as precise as the notions of memory that we have. No? So memory is not first represented and then negated by forgetting, but how we operationally, how we computationally think of memory, the inverse to it is an as precise mirroring or reversal of how we can think of forgetting. And this in Serre, the book where he expresses this or elaborates this most is The Incandescent, one of the late books that he develops. So the crucial thing is, and that's what makes it architectonic, in none of these models is any meaning represented or is any correlation between sense, significance, and meaning at stake. If you want, it's a purely syntactical, no? Or a canonic, that's what I would prefer to call it. It's canonic relations which are at stake. So these are what Serre calls les modèles, no? In the plural, ces modèles mathématiques. So Serre's book, and he met a lot of offense, let's say, or he caused a lot of offense with this approach. This is one of the reasons, he says later, why he never got a professorship in France, because it put him in a difficult relation to his supervisors. He says the Leibniz book is about the Leibniz's system, but this notion of the system needs to be approached through analogicity. So through architectonics, through proportionate thinking, not through representation or correlation. And he says, so fortunately, Leibniz's system is made. This is from the introductory part. The 2 slides I have are just the map where he maps himself his own project. And the translation is Dipel. So there's not yet a translation, but I'm working on one. So fortunately, Leibniz's system is made in such a way, if we are careful, that in a single movement, it constantly builds itself and speaks of itself. It forms itself and describes its formation. That it intertwines, if we may use this word, its semantics and its syntax. In order to think this, he brings in the notion of the paradigm, which is the key notion that the Timaeus introduces, as far as I know, into natural philosophy. And what he wants to approach this notion of the paradigm with is what he calls a transversal optics through all the regions of the world. So here is the Pantope, this subject. It's places and regions, no general space needs to be involved. And this notion of optics, that's what I wanted to talk about first, but I cannot speak simply about that yet. But it's important that optics and perspective are like exterior to each other. No? A perspective gives a point of view, a subjective point of view, or a generalized point of view, and optics provides instruments, in the plural, that can mathematically describe and articulate perspective. So they are just as inverse as the memory and the forgetting to each other, no? Or one is the condition for the other, or the aim for the other, however we want to think of this. And this notion of optics places optics with mechanics, but with quantum mechanics, in a way which directly translates into how today, for example, we send information across the whole world. So the optical fiber cables, they're working with an optics which directly implements on different scales of matter, of course, today, than it was possible at Leibniz's time, but it directly implements the caustics. The caustics is that kind of mathematics which gives this optics. No? In the caustics, the shadows radiate as well, because it's not just light and shadow, it's not body and its shadow. The point, and this is perhaps one of the most cryptic things in Serre's thinking with the gnomon, so his approach to geometry. He says objects today cast shadows again. And it's a paradox, because if it's an object in logics, it's logics in general, so precisely no shadow is needed because we have the pure formulations. For Serre's point, objects cast shadows again, because we never see, it's not about having a surface and the transparency, it's having skins and peels, no? that envelop each other. It's a geometry in covering spaces. I have another slide, which I think it's the next one, which can give a better impression. This is also from very early in Serre's book. And here he writes, so the following study, he says, is restricted to the problems of systematicity posed by Leibniz's philosophy. We want to try to indicate what is meant and what is covered by his affirmation, repeated 100 times, that everything conspires, that everything agrees and consents. So here is the notion of harmonics at stake. And of course, the tricky point with Leibniz is how, or is this notion of conspiration and of consent not a notion of harmony rather than harmonics? And Serre's point is, yes, it is, but that's only that's not how the systematicity operates. So the systematicity operates with harmonics, while Leibniz believes that it can trigger this harmony, but for it to operate, it doesn't depend on this harmony to be real or shared. No, so it needs faith, but no belief. That's perhaps how I would put it. So, and then further on, I highlighted this. He says, any problem of systematicity presents itself as an infinite task. And here we would have to follow all the paths of the network, all the threads of the skein to hope to reach the overall idea. And here I picked this, so a lot, in many places he describes Leibniz as following the labyrinth with Ariadne's thread. But this thread now moves through a notion of network in which points act as stars. No? So it's a geometry which is always caustic relative to the light reflected by a constellation upon a particular problem, interest, or region or place. And this term skein, I did not know it. I owe it to D. Bell. It's a beautiful term. It means a length of thread or yarn loosely coiled and knotted. It also means an element that forms part of a complex or complicated whole. And this is, I think, that the notion in which it works really well by bridging the Timaeus, because the crucial assumption that Plato makes in the Timaeus is that the cosmos is an animal. No? So there is a soul. It starts with soul. That's the primacy of the harmonics in the whole approach. So the cosmos is an animal, and this is not, I mean, I wonder today sometimes, no, we are so eager to attribute agency to objects and to things and to everything. Why is it such a big difference to say, okay, then all the things have soul? No? So, I mean, Georgios asked yesterday morning, do we even have a soul? Can we prove that we have one? So this is the kind of question I would just abstract from and say, well, it helps to assume that we do, no? Because it establishes a kind of a language game in which we can acquire a certain kind of precision which doesn't claim anything in particular, but which can integrate, which can incorporate a very complex kind of thinking. And the thing that this assumption does in the Timaeus with the cosmos being an animal is that he can think of elements as bodies. So water, fire, earth, and air, they are in the sensible sphere, literally the elements which never appear pure. So there is no water that does not also involve all the other elements. But nevertheless, he thinks abstractly of the elements as bodies, so as wholes. That is the important thing. And these wholes, they are distributed throughout the cosmos, but they always appear in mixed constellations. And such a notion of the element takes elements out of its axiomatic grounding, no? And if you want, allows us to make projections into the sky or from the sky with a notion of elements. So the elements always, that is the main point, I think, where, for example, Merleau-Ponty, for whom the chiasm is very important as well, and the notion of flesh, thinks the crossing of the elements as well. So skein, it also means that then if we can do a geometry of these threads, no? So if we can map them, and mapping them now not as representing them, but as through mathematical models, which can give us models of covering schemes, no? of coverings of places. Then we have this kind of systematicity, which does not consist in itself. It is a systematicity which lives from mathematical models that are put into a tuning or in a constellation in order to account for something very situational. So it's universal, but situational or regional, if you want. It skips the abstract and the generalization into the domain of dimensional space. And it's also interesting. I was very surprised where Plato talks about the notion of space, no? The Ami des Werdens. His way to address it is money and gold. No? It's very significant, I believe, for the enthusiasm in epistemology today, because this notion of genericity is imagined by Plato as, so his problem, the way he puts it is this, he says, all the things which are in the sensible world have becoming, so of those we speak according to how it is the custom to name them. No? So this is probable truth. It's not represented truth, it's probable truth in the Timaeus. But then being, we could not, so how could we know its names? We cannot know its names. And then he says, but this notion of space or the Ami des Werdens is the assumption that if you imagine a sculptor who has as much gold as he wants, and he can mold out of this gold any appearance of the world of becoming, to take form, to take shape as a statue, as statues out of gold, then how would we address gold? Because it's not the four elements, no? It's a homogeneous abstraction for it. But this gold could be receptive to the infinite amount of possible appearances that need not be countable, as long as the fabricator is still alive to keep making his statues out of gold. This is the notion of space that the Timaeus introduces as a kind of a third domain between the two, the sensible and the intelligible, no? As the one in which the proportioning manifests ultimately. But it involves a totalization of all possible architectures by bringing it into the idea of sculpting out of gold. All right, time is almost up, I believe. Huh? So let's maybe to show you a little bit how these ideas can be followed. So, or they help you when you try to read Serre's book. This is the table of content. I was wondering for a very, very long time, why is Serre obviously working with the architectonic key notions of scenography and iconography, while I think there is one passage which did not tell me anything, never mentioning orthography. How then to think of orthography? Does this not leave this role of language and logics nevertheless? And then through reading and working with the Timaeus, I came to think about the analemma, no? So through these planes, there is a course of the sun over a whole year, which gives the figure of the lying 8, which is also the figure of the infinite in mathematics. So this is the course of the sun over a year. It gives the analemma, and the analemma has it is at the core so Vitruv wrote a whole book on gnomons, on sun clocks, involving or on the basis of the analemma. And there is a notion, and this my Greek friend tells me, I could not follow the etymology. He says the notion of the schema in Greek can be, one of its facets is that it names a bounded area animated by the sun. No? And this is a notion which suddenly becomes extremely telling. So then when we have any kind of shadow that we cast out, that we follow, that we mathematize, it gives us a bounded area, but this boundary is the boundedness of a body. No, so it's not a limit. It's not a rational limit. It's a bounded area, and it's of a body because the area itself is animated. So its soul is touched, if you want, no, by the sun. And this starts to make a lot of sense in following what Serre means when he says that the gnomon is an artificial intelligence, which has been here for not just since we have personal computers, no, as a way to think about an impersonal cogito that is at work in mathematical thinking, which is universal, but interestingly, it doesn't give us the way that has been stigmatized or celebrated as the royal path to knowledge. It's not that. It's a path to knowledge. And with this, I close. I have more, but perhaps if the discussion allows it, I can pick it up later. But I want to close with this picture, because then mathematical thinking gives us not a royal path to knowledge. It gives us one where we are pantomiming everything. And this pantomiming needs, okay, I am the dog, but I am not owned by anybody. Yeah. So it affirms that there is orderings, and orderings involves hierarchies, but the mathematical models articulate these hierarchies. They don't represent any kind of nature. That's what makes it a natural philosophy, no? So the person then who wants to think mathematically, who is ready to say, for what I want to figure out, I don't take myself so much as the main source of inspiration or ambition to realize something. I want to get rid of myself. It's quite Hegelian, no, in this gesture. It has a lot to do with the notion of the self as Hegel develops it. Who, and this is maybe the last point, no, Hegel's dissertation was on the constellation of the stars, and he was reading the Timaeus. And I am by far not an expert of Hegel. I was very allergic to Hegel for a very, very long time. I still am, to a large extent. But this notion of the Entzweiung, I don't remember how the English gives it. It's very wrong. It takes away the lambda character in the figure of the Entzweiung, which is at work in the way how Hegel was very likely thinking of a dialectics, which involves the neutralization of the self. No, so this is the self-consciousness that can be happy. No, it can never be happy, but it can be unhappy. No, and the dialectic unfolds in a way that we try not to become unhappy, but there is no positive outlook that it can be happy. Die Entzweiung, so the lambda. And yes, I am a dog. I'm very, very fond of dogs now. So maybe I leave it at that and we can have a discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much. Of course, I would open the floor to immediate questions, but maybe people still need some time for ideas. So maybe I can start with the first question, problematization of your presentation. And maybe going back to the very beginning, and also something that, in a sense, maybe you already skipped by since the first summary that you sent, and that you mentioned in the beginning about this idea of the canon. So in case that, say, people need a reminder, which is basically a notion for like a measuring rod that basically gave rise to a form of linear thinking or drawing straight lines. No? So therefore is connected to the idea of a ruler and a rule, the way it creates this. And of course, this immediately brought me back to the discussion that we had about Stiegler and technics, and how technics, in a sense, precondition thinking, precondition social developments. And what I found very interesting, in a sense, how you then extend this argument onto that field of science that we all, in a sense, feel is more abstract, where exactly this embeddedness is not necessarily there. And you guide us through all these kind of things that how specifically through geometry, the deviation that the Earth is not perfectly perpendicular to the solar plane, that these kind of deviations came to be technicized so as to derive a certain type of knowledge again. And therefore, in some sense, what we need to pay attention to is precisely this kind of situational aspect of these kind of things. These are the abstraction, no? So like the relationship between presence and abstraction, or the way that you distinguish abstraction and generalization, right? This also in our way. And then you challenge this model itself in that it doesn't have to be strictly orthogonal, but it is chiastic, no? And that it brings us, I think, very interestingly through Leibniz to this idea, to this critique that we often confuse ratio with proportion. So that is exactly not A to B, but what A to B is to C to D. And that then the question about analogy, that when these things coincide, when A to B equals C to D, that then of course creates a very specific system again that we can think with, and we can think with deviations from this ideal model. And I think I very much appreciate this this idea, and I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate a little bit further on that, and maybe also with the last point that you made in terms of the Entzweiung. Like I couldn't help immediately think of this in terms of either the notion that Stiegler also uses with bifurcation, so that bifurcation as that creates a sort of path dependency or scale dependency, also as you said in the beginning, which then is generative of certain forms of embodied forms of creating knowledge, but then also maybe in regards to diffractive thinking. So in a sense, thinking with the differences. So I was wondering if you, in a sense, would diffract Sayre's reading that already diffracts Leibniz's thinking.
Yeah, maybe the last point first, since it's most present. I really try not to make a disciplinary territory for Sayre scholarship. So whenever this starts to form, I want to run. I don't think that's the right gesture. So in that sense of a diffractive reading, no. But in another sense of the diffractive, which actually I learned a lot from Iris, where the notion of the bifurcation plays together into the trunk. No, it's not the liberation out of the trunk into the diversification, but the diversification which needs to flow back into the trunk as well. So it's memory and forgetting. And in that sense, very much, yes, with the canon. And with the canon, I'm glad you pick it up because this is actually really a crucial point, and it was very hard for me to get a little bit of hold. I don't have it clear, but so I was saying the orthography is missing, no? In Leibniz's book, we have iconography, we have scenography, so we have the ground plan, the groundworks, and we have the projections, the walls, but we don't have orthography. until I started to just search wildly about this analemma. What was it really? Because reading with Ruf didn't help me, honestly. I didn't understand what he was after with that. He brings it, then he relates it to the zodiac and to the constellations, but this astrology, how to make that fit into the constellations, I couldn't get it. Actually, now I start to get a feeling, because the constellations of the stars in the networks, that Serge Leibniz book does. But Serge Leibniz book is the one I know least, perhaps, of his readings. But it helps at precisely that point. And the analemma, interestingly, was known in antiquity as a means for orthographic projection. No? Orthographic projection in Vitruve and Ptolemy. And that's also interesting, because Ptolemy, so what Serge, why he says we need to affirm, or we can affirm Serge's Leibniz's analog systematicity, is that both Galileo and Kepler are scientifically right. They just have inverse views upon things. It's not a progress story where we kind of get over a narcissistic humiliation or not. It's different ways of projecting, and the way that, okay, I leave it at that. So, and then the lemma, here we have again the proportion. It says the word analemma means much the same as lemma. The analemma is for graphical constructions that work with orthographic projections. What the lemma is for geometrical demonstrations. No? So what Serge does is he takes geometry. So usually, no, the dictum was always geometry. So before axiomatics, before logics takes over the discourse of geometry, it was always, we need to describe its elements such that they can be crafted with nothing artificial, no technology at work, except the ruler and the compass. And this is part of why the search for solutions of how to square the circle or how to double the cube and so on were such steps of inventions throughout the history of mathematics. A lot of them would work with artifacts, and then it can be approximated, no? But the abstractions that are needed to invent, for example, the method of exhaustion, which is a precursor of the infinitesimal method by Eudoxos, I think, very old. So these kinds of things come out of trying to do the impossible, not in order to demonstrate that the impossible is actually possible, but because it expands the scopes, no, the indefinite scopes of abstraction that goes vertical a little bit more, not to reach other heights, not ultimately, but a little bit more, and also a little bit deeper. So it's orthographic projection, and in Serre, the question of technology now, I would insist it's not technology, it's techniques, it's an artifact, it's precisely not the axiomatic systematization of how things can be deduced or induced or inferred or even abducted. Abduction comes closest, but it's another story. So it's artifacts, and Serre wrote this, composed this book, and I know from some of the authors in it now that they were not convinced by the introduction he wrote, Elements of a History of Science. No, it's a compendium on major fields, regions where science did huge steps of abstractions, and Serre wrote of in this book one chapter on the gnomon, which I think is the densest and the richest text, but also very, very difficult to decipher, no? And decipher doesn't mean to get it, so to make mathematical models that one can draw from it. That's how I would understand deciphering. And in it he affirms and he insists that the gnomon had several meanings, no? So the gnomon was also, like the canon and like the ruler, literally an artifact which would give the right angle, no? That which you could lay on things to take measure. So you don't do geometry only through how can I construct it, but you take geometric objects of which you say there must be a geometry, and you don't try to construct it artificially, but you measure them artificially by laying measure upon them. And the way how these artifacts are integrated in a synthetic whole, this is the notion of a canon, which tries to give a model of how to proportion typical elements of things. For example, the canon of Polyclate, which gives the proportioning of the human body as an idealization, of course. And yet it gives a means of then describing. Now, if we say, now we don't want to construct the ideal body of the polyclade, the idealization of its canon helps us to take measures, so to describe and be as close as we can to all sorts of bodies, because it gives a canon. And the canon is not representative in the sense of an aim to strive for. It's an integral.
Would you then argue that, let's say, the subtitle of Sarah's book with the stars to the networks, in a sense, gives us a different take on a geometric method, in some sense, that you try to, in a sense, theorize through the chiasm as then the more topological, in some sense. So, in a sense, a much more embedded, worlded way of constructing our world.
Yeah, the point would be exactly, so to say, so the pantopological is actually a good keyword, because what topology always gives us is structures, no? And then we can have a structure of all this, no, a structure of the structure. Then we are with set theory, we are with the impossibility of the ultimate one, but they all work like Russian puppets nested within one another. And what we can do with Serre's approach of geometry is to say, no, we can actually measure structures. So structures, they are the orthographic projections in our ideas that will guide, our orientation of how we want to describe something very specific, so something very situational, something that is universal but has no general reference model. That's why we need to model it mathematically in order to pay attention to its singularity or its uniqueness, if you want. Even so, it is universal because it's not either unique or specific. There is uniqueness to everything, just like there is universality to everything. So that's also one thing that results out of this credit to say, okay, the cosmos is an animal. No, it has a soul. And we are all cosmic.
Thank you very much. So first, thank you because it's opening of the pennies, as you know, 1, 2, 3, where's the fourth? And classes, they tend to brush it away as kind of dramatizing nonsense of Plato, but it's perplexing for so long, and this kind of lambda figure sort of might have just solved it. So that's wonderful. But then the other thing is the function of the elements. We talked about how in a way if you think of the cosmos as a soul, as a kind of living being with a soul, then they usually are a schematic kind of dimension. I just wonder where you stand then with the other thing that Plato does, which is precisely to algebraize, if you like, the elements, to say, well, look, this is like pyramids, square, and then they actually can be analyzed further down to pure geometry, and that leads further to precisely this idea of the Cora, right? The idea that you were describing very beautifully of the kind of occupation of the body from the shadow, or like the shadow is that kind of schema of the sun in a way. But the question is here, like, is that all there is ultimately? So because, and here comes the problem, because he has this idea of the goals that you gave, and if you take someone like Simondon, right, his critique of this way of thinking is precisely that hylomorphism is a practice of the master that actually does not have to engage with the material, that thinks that I can make anything out of anything, He wants a house made out of paper, sure, I'll make that, right? And because it's not a craftsman who is aware of the actual materiality and the fact that the thing is already always formed. And so my question is, if Plato is moving towards that kind of geometrization, quasi-algebraization, and so we have this kind of pure aura, what happens to this materiality that is almost resistant to schematization? Make sense?
Yeah. So in my understanding, it's precisely not going to a pure Chora, just like the notion of the polyclatic canon doesn't want to realize idealizations of its model. Chora plays the same canonic role like a canonic means of proportioning does. What it grants as such, because it can inform our ideas through orthographic projections, is to attend to singular constellations. And the mapping that Serre does with the elements into the Platonic bodies, into the Platonic solids, it is an extremely intricate argument which makes a kind of, what it tries to open up is how scales can be translated into each other from the smallest, like what kind of liquids helps our skin. So from wellness, from health questions to, of course, horoscopic influences that determine from the day when we are born, because the horoscopes were a practice to socialize, if you want, astronomy, no, at that time. So people would know the constellations because they were mythically and religiously, semantically coded. So one doesn't need to follow the mathematical thinking, there's storytelling around it. So that's the first thing. It's precise. So I know the architects are totally obsessed with Chora and saying architecture is Chora. I would say no, exactly not. No, exactly not. And the other thing with the algebraization is interesting because he places it precisely by saying the fourth is absent. He puts the substitution logics, which algebra always brings, no? So places are void. They can be occupied by several things. He puts that to discourse, you see, not to the means of which the discourse will talk, not to the teachings that will be conveyed, but to the situational setup of conveying teachings through talking and writing. So there needs to be the empty place where there can be mobility and change of configuration in the lived social practice of doing philosophy, of architecting a cosmos, no? a world, not in the teachings that are of which it talks. And it also that needs to be that way. That then everything that he talks about, even the lambda, even all these mathematical, very precise Pythagorean ideas, they are always only probable knowledge. And probable knowledge in antiquity, it meant knowledge which cannot be legitimated. No? It meant knowledge which lives from a certain common sense that is distributed. So it involves, they had a distinction, and it's very, I still am confused about it, but they have true and false opinions, for example. No? It's not that opinion is false or biased, and truth is not an opinion. They have true and false opinions. And I think the determination between true and false opinions, this involves Chora, this involves the gold, no? So the canon, where you would solve this, but that would be a territorial, if you want, a territorial moralization of it, which is not in the nature of things, but which comes from creating living conditions. Yeah. Does it answer what you were asking?
Yeah.
I have a very practical question. There's a friend of mine who's a big Serre freak, and he always jokes at me. What he sort of like invents this future academic direction where he said, "Yeah, I'm just waiting that you can translate the book you've been talking about all along." And so I'm very happy that now I can tell him that I met someone who is doing that work for me. So my question is, do you have any idea like when the translation will be published? Yeah.
I will be too optimistic in whatever I say, I'm sure, but I hope in maybe 2 years or so.
Okay.
Yeah, I was working on this with Bill Ross, and unfortunately he died last summer. So now it's a bit in a reconfiguration but I hope to make it available soon. Also, I will give emphasis on making because it's much more scholarly written than the other books by Serre. So I will probably sacrifice a little bit of the poeticness that should go in a translation of a work like that for the sake of making its mathematical thinking available as soon as possible. Yeah.
Thank you. Very fascinating, but I have a apologize about the question. So, in France, you have this long tradition of mathematics throughout the 20th century. Putten aligns himself with Russell's logic system. And then in the 50s, a lot of French philosophers kind of came out on this, in the readings of Leibniz. And I wonder how Sarah relates to that tradition, like to the reading of the 50s by so much to the that like they believe in the autonomy of mathematics and give up on the logicism, but they also give up at the same time on the idea of a pure syntax. It seems to me, so this that Sarah tries to get back this idea of a pure syntax.
I'm very glad of your question. No, this is deep swamps, huh? And I don't claim I must to overview how the constellations are. But what you said in the end, I think, is extremely helpful, because there is not, by all I understand, after a pure syntax. That is why information theory is so constitutive for everything he thinks. So the interplay, so the information as a mathematical quantity, it cannot translate. So it's a natural philosophy approach. It's not even a helomorphism in that, no. So it's a I wouldn't call it an empirical approach either, because the kind of empirics would be between this impersonal faculty of imagination perceiving abstractions. So I don't know if it's adequate to claim empiricism for this kind of speculative field, but he's not after the pure syntax. He was so excited about information theory as a mathematics and as a physics, precisely because it gives a physicality back to the logical abstractions that are at work in technology. That's why I insist always so much techniques, please, not technology. So logics then goes with the axiomatization, but it doesn't need to. With Sartre, it would more go, and this is how I understand why he opted, rather than participating in the discourse now and clarifying his positions, he opted for a poetic way of writing, for a literary way of writing. And the literary way of writing can speak in many tongues. For me, this is the beautiful thing that Sartre's books do. They can speak on a level which I can appreciate without having read the scientists and the mathematicians as a kind of a poetic fabulation of our time. But I can also read it. I didn't find yet a place where it wouldn't be consistent. So in many layers, again, in many layers. Or Harlequin, no? It's the oscillation between Harlequin and Pierrot, where there is the incandescent as the instructed third, so the kind of education that would come out of this. And all I know, and I don't really understand, I offended a lot the people who are administrating Sartre's Nachlass in a conference last year, because they want to bring it into a history of ideas. And by all I like about Sartre, it's where he always tried to flee from. No? So not a history of ideas that would classify him in alliances like that. All I know is that his two supervisors of this thesis, who were so offended by the thesis, was Bachelard and Willem. And it's super, it needs to do any kind of justice or adequacy to describe the because it's not the usual conflict where you have intuitionists against formalists, or where you have logicism, empirical logicism versus abstract logicism, or any of these camps that are there in analytical philosophy. It's not about that. It's the chiastic crossing is much more subtle, involving different things. The figure my feeling is that where it would be somebody like Grothendieck. No? So it's the affirmation of the algebraization with Bourbaki, but precisely not in order to find the computational language. No, even like Wolfram is claiming now. No. So no, precisely not. It's not a universal language. It's characteristics which are universal, but there are many of them, and that's possible because they are new material. So they're physics. they're energetic. It's also why he keeps insisting, no, on saying language is une puissance. Because every language can always say everything that can be said in a language. But that doesn't mean that one language maps as a representation of the other. That is why there is translation before there is representation or vocabularies. So la langue est une puissance. He can always say all that can be said. And une puissance is not it's a potential plus possibility plus potentiality. It's all of these things. It's capability as well as capacity. So it's the crossing, it's the flesh, it's the infleshed, the body of thinking, which is of flesh, made of a natural philosophy. That's how I would say. Yeah.
Thank you, Vera. I think, unfortunately, we're already, let's say, running out of time, so I have to suggest to continue the discussion in the coming break. We have half an hour break before we go on. So, thank you very much. 20 minutes.